Ready to start? Good evening, everyone. Particularly also to those of you who are online. Thandeka, can people hear me online? Okay. Let me introduce really what is an extremely impressive panel. The procedure I'm going to adopt is to ask each of the panelists to speak for about 10 minutes. And then we have an equally impressive group of 5 respondents who will each be given an opportunity, say, for around 2 minutes to respond. And then depending on the time available, it would be helpful to open it up for an interactive exchange, if you like, through questions. And that will also be an opportunity once more for our speakers and panelists, as well as our respondents, to add any further thoughts. Now, we are privileged to have Professor Jacqueline Garrick from the University of Southern California, who has a very impressive record of work on whistleblower protection. For reasons of time, I'm not going to go through all the list of her achievements. But I do want to draw your attention to the book she has just published with Springer, entitled The Psychosocial Impacts of Whistleblower Protection. The publication of this book, and I think this conversation, comes at an important point, I think, in our country's public debate about how to deal with whistleblower protection as part of an anti-corruption agenda. We've had a number of very worrying assassinations of whistleblowers. I think of Babita Barakaran right now, but we've had a number of such appalling incidents, which has also unfortunately affected tertiary institutions. Mm-hmm. So it's a serious question. Deputy Minister John Jeffrey's department, the Department of Justice, is looking at legislative reform, and so is the Anti-Corruption Council that I chair, and we have as one of our panelists Thandeka Gqubule-Mbeki, who's passionate about this, about whistleblower protection, and we were fortunate to have her participate in this panel. Now, I did say to Professor Garrick beforehand that reading a little bit about the book, I haven't had the opportunity to read the book yet, was an education for me as well, even though, you know, I have been thinking about this question. In the Anti-Corruption Council, we have a work stream on whistleblower protection, which Thandeka is heading up. And what struck me was how your book encourages us to think in much broader terms about whistleblower protection. I had understood it, as I think is more commonly the case, as requiring whistleblowers who face threats to life and limb, who need protection, literally, because they face such awful threats. But what your book invites us to think about whistleblower protection is the kind of harms that they face, including socio-psychological harms, the various forms of retaliation that they experience. You know, I think you have some words I'm encountering for the first time, like gaslighting, doxing, career blocking, devaluing, which invites us to think about the role of the other departments, for instance, the Department of Health, and other professionals, psychologists, healthcare professionals, lawyers who are representing clients who are being victimized in the workplace, and so forth. So we're looking forward to your presentation about the book, and I'm quite sure that it's going to have a significant impact on the way we are thinking in South Africa about whistleblower protection, as well as about an anti-corruption agenda. It's becoming clearer and clearer that while it's important to focus on investigation and prosecution, that an anti-corruption agenda requires a broader perspective. Society has to be involved. The private sector has a role. We have to be thinking about prevention. And when it comes to whistleblower protection, we certainly need to be thinking in much broader terms than I think hitherto has been the case. And with respect to the important work that the Department of Justice is doing, as well as the council which I chair, I think we are being challenged to think about whistleblower protection in much broader terms, in interdisciplinary terms. And I will just say one final thing, since we are at a university, is that I think anti-corruption education, integrating anti-corruption courses, including accredited courses at degree level, but other kinds of offerings, it seems to me, is becoming critical. And so looking at the law school's curriculum, but also other faculty is going to be an important challenge for us. And I look forward to working with you to help us think through what the tertiary institutions can do to support the country's anti-corruption agenda going forward. With that, I'm going to ask, first of all, our Deputy Minister, John Jeffery. I think I know John for the last 30 or 40 years, maybe, to share his thoughts with us. Welcome, Minister.
Thanks very much, and good evening, everybody here and everybody online. It's always sort of unfortunate being, I think, the first speaker. It's much nicer being able to respond to other things that people raise. But just to agree with Firoz that we have a serious problem of corruption in South Africa, and there's also a problem of particularly people involved in speaking out against corruption, but speaking out from the context of working in a particular area for a particular company, private or for the state, getting assassinated. We have two laws that are relevant. The one is the Protected Disclosures Act. That is a year 2000 law, which got updated, I think, in 2017. And the intention of that law is basically to protect whistleblowers in the employment setup. And the amendments that were made in 2017 were to widen the people covered. But the issue that it's trying to do is protect people in their employment situation or their work situation who come speak out, who are whistleblowers effectively. So obviously somebody who is not employed, if you want to speak about corruption at Eskom and you're not working for Eskom, you're doing something else, I don't think this this law would be of that much use to you as the way it currently stands. However, even with the provisions trying to protect people from detriment in the employment sector, it's not working, I think, as effectively as it should. And so with both of the laws, we are, as Firoz has said, looking at what changes that need to be made. Just on that part, there was a study trip to Canada, which has a sort of similar human rights dispensation to South Africa. So that has been quite useful. There is work being done on a document which would be, I think the Anti-Corruption Council will be consulted on it if they're not involved in it already. And the intention is to finalize that and present that to the President by the end of April of next month. But it's looking at issues such as what changes should be made to the Protected Disclosures Act. The one issue that has been raised is the incentivizing of whistleblowers, that because they suffer such a lot of detriment, that it would be good to encourage people financially to be whistleblowers. It is something that we considered when we were dealing with the 2017 bill at that stage, but opted not to go for it. We do have provision in the Companies Act and the Environmental Management Act, I think it is, that does provide for incentives to be paid to people who speak out against company fraud in the case of the Companies Act and in environmental degradation in terms of the NEMA Act. But I don't think that's actually been used. The problem we would find, and I don't know how it relates to other jurisdictions, is that, and this has been a problem in Canada just with people being on the witness protection program, the issue gets raised of, is their evidence truthful? Because they're benefiting from the evidence that they're giving. So that is something we've got to look at quite carefully. Our courts, well, there would be an opening to try and discredit a witness on the basis of you're benefiting. You've got a reason to lie because you're going to get some money from this incentivization program. So that's basically just on whistleblowing. The other law, which is sort of relevant when it comes to the assassinations, the attacks on whistleblowers, is the Witness Protection Act. Now that is actually not aimed at whistleblowers more broadly. It's aimed at witnesses, as it says, although the definition of a witness is not just in a criminal matter. It's quite broad. So you can be you can qualify for witness protection if you're testifying before a commission, the Zondo Commission, or any other inquiry or any tribunal, things like that. So just in terms of Babita Diokaran's work with the Special Investigating Unit, she could have qualified for witness protection. The problem with witness protection is that there's one solution, and that is basically relocation. You've got to go out of society while you're while the threat is against you, and you can take your family with you. So I think I can't remember the figures, but it's about I think it's about 300 odd witnesses on average who are on the program, and then additional family members, spouses, children, that kind of thing. But you basically cannot be doing what you were doing before. And I suspect for many witnesses that is not something they are prepared to do. So the other aspect is then, which you don't actually need legislation for, is how is security provided? And it's things where there have been disputes before. And I'll just go into some detail. How am I doing for time? I should have set my you're watching it, okay. I should have set my stopwatch. But the issue would be, I mean, let's say for judicial officers who are dealing with cases that subject them to threats. We do have provision for emergency protection to everybody, including witnesses, for I think it's 14 days. That doesn't compare favorably to Canada, which has provides initial interim protection for emergency protection. They call it for 180 days, so 14 to 180. But basically, then there's a risk assessment done by, I think, the police as to whether this person is facing a threat. If they're found to be facing a threat, particularly if they're a judicial officer, I think a prosecutor as well, they're given protection. To what extent private people qualify for that protection is something that I think more work needs to be done on, because there's then often disputes between private people who may be witnesses but don't want to go on the witness protection program and want to still be able to carry out their normal life, which would include such thing as going to nightclubs. Go to nightclubs with 2 security guards or whatever is the intention or more. And that's obviously, there've been some tensions with that in the past. So that aspect also needs to be looked at. Generally, we would have seen, for the limited scope that it has in terms of the relocation, that the witness protection program works quite well. We've only lost 1 person on the program, and that person temporarily left the program to go and stay with her partner. And while she was at her partner's place, was assassinated. But it's very limited in its scope, and it's not for most people. One of the issues that in terms of the comparison with Canada that was made was that in Canada they do a psychological assessment of the person before they go on the program to see if they're suitable. We don't do that here, and obviously if a person is on the program and wants to leave, well, they can leave, but they are probably exposing elements of the program in terms of where safe houses are, that kind of thing. I think let me stop there. I don't know how much time I've used, but I'd rather give additional time to responding to questions or comments that come up.
Thank you very much, Minister. It's now my great pleasure to call upon Professor Garrick to to share experience and maybe reflect a little bit on this wonderful book.
All right, well, thank you so much for having me here. It is a complete and true honor to be here at this university in the Mandela Institute and being part of this historic discussion. So I'm a former Army officer. I'm a social worker by background, but I was also an Army officer, which I know sounds like a contradiction. The career that I had was primarily focused on combat trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder. Started with Vietnam vets, and then in our more recent wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. So I was working with that population, with trauma, with suicide prevention initiatives, when I also made a disclosure and discovered what a hostile work environment could really be like. And so as I was exploring these things, I came across other whistleblowers because I was looking for ways to understand what was happening and the processes in place in the US. very similar in some ways to the rest of the world, and in other ways very unique and very American. But the process was confusing, and that's what they all have in common, is that they're confusing processes. So as I was trying to figure this out, I started to try to talk to other whistleblowers, and I didn't even know I was a whistleblower at the time. It's not what I thought I was doing. I thought I was bringing to the attention of my leadership what was fraud, waste, and abuse, what was conflicts of interest. I didn't think I was doing anything outside of the norm or anything unusual. So as my career trajectory started to swirl downward instead of continue upward, I began to realize that there were more forces at play, more powerful forces at play than I was initially aware of. So as I'm starting to deal with all of this and I'm having conversations with other whistleblowers, we recognize the need for joining forces because we were stronger together. It takes a village. So we were really trying to figure out ways we can help each other. And again, my mental health background, I've used psychosocial supports many times over the years. I was even, I've been in Afghanistan with our troops. I was in the former Soviet Union with the Russians who had been in Afghanistan decades before that. So I know peer support programs work, and I started to build a peer support program. This was my first book on mentoring, a couple of minutes of a session. And I realized that there is evidence-based and trauma-informed steps we can take to help each other. So we started to build network, and then I started to realize, quite like my combat veterans from decades before, there was a gap. They didn't have language, and it took us decades to create post-traumatic stress disorder as a diagnosis and an understanding. It wasn't until the 1980s, 1981, when PTSD became a recognized diagnosis in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders. So it was in those early years of working with combat vets, Vietnam vets, who were being diagnosed as malingering, having war neurosis. There was lots of argument and fight that PTSD and Vietnam vets weren't really traumatized. And it wasn't until we saw other populations start to step forward and say, me too. We had the World War II veterans that began to say, hey, you know what? I've dealt with my problems all this time with alcohol. I've had anger issues. Spousal abuse was an issue. So it took other generations of veterans to start coming forward. It also took veterans in other countries to start coming forward. The British came to the table and started to share their experiences. We won't go into some of that, but all over the globe, they were having issues. We knew the Russians were having issues. Everybody who had fought in World War II was starting to identify, yes, we've had trauma in our populations too. So there was this universality of the trauma. And this is important here because when we start to look at whistleblowers and whistleblowing, there's a commonality of the trauma. And so as I started to look at how do these things fit together? How are my combat vets like my fellow whistleblowers? What do we have in common? What does it mean to feel like you're in a fight for your life, doing battle, trying to survive, losing everything, feeling betrayed, feeling helpless and hopeless? And that's when I realized whistleblowers didn't have that language. They didn't have that taxonomy. So this book is 3 years of research in the making. We started to look at what did it mean to be retaliated against, and I call them the toxic tactics of retaliation. So you mentioned gaslighting, mobbing, marginalizing, shunning, devaluing, double binding, counter-accusing, bullying, and those, and I've got them broken down into 9 domains in the book, and we've developed indicators for what I call the whistleblower retaliation checklist, so that we can start identifying what are those tactics, and then what psychosocial impact do they have? So for example, if you've been a victim of gaslighting, then you are seeing the elements of not being believed, of having your memories questioned, your credibility questioned, your character assassinated, you're not reliable. And what does that make you do? Well, that makes you question yourself. You start to ruminate and you think and you think and you think. Well, what does that mean? Well, those things in the symptomatology world are what we recognize as intrusive thoughts, flashbacks, nightmares. When you are being shunned, you start to get to be very avoidant. You don't want to be exposed to other people. You isolate, you alienate. When you're being mobbed, you feel very under attack, so you fight back. That triggers the sense of anger, of hypervigilance, right? I mean, they say if you're paranoid and people are out to get you, it's probably a good idea to be paranoid. But in these cases, when you start to really feel those traumatic stressors and the symptoms become very real, and then you take what was somebody's worldviews and you shatter them. And so their psychosocial world has changed. Their emotional state has changed. And as all this is happening, and these cases are quite prolonged, they go on for decades, as some people on screen or in this room can probably attest to. My case took me 5 years to get adjudicated, and I won my case. But that prolonged exposure is that constant dealing with the trauma over and over and over again. So, Mr. Minister, I would beg to differ with you that very few people get into whistleblowing because they think it's a way of making a fast buck. There is no fast buck in this situation. It is years and years of your life. Most whistleblowers that I know have sold their homes, their cars, they've gotten divorced. In the US, you have savings accounts that are for your children, for your retirement. All of that gets decimated. There is no big wins in these cases. When we were just in the UK regarding this bill that they're trying to start an office of the whistleblower. They reported and they looked at 4% of whistleblowers win their cases. 4% in the UK. That's a little bit worse than in the United States, where maybe 10% win. In Canada, it's abominable. The Canadians, I'm surprised you're looking at the Canadians, to be honest, because according to, I think it was Transparency International or the Corporate Crime Observatory, one of them did an analysis of whistleblower programs globally, and Canada did not come anywhere near the rest of the industrialized countries. It was one of the worst because they have no whistleblower protections. They have programs, they have no protections. And when we look at what they're doing in the UK, and this idea that we need to have an office of the whistleblower, it's because they want to put the focus back on the crime so that there is no retaliation. And if you put the focus back on the crime and the criminals, you don't make the whistleblower the victim, you make them the witness, the hero in the case, so that they can go on with their lives and the perpetrators can go to jail. And honestly, that's what most whistleblowers want to see. They want to see the water cleaned up. They want to see patient safety. I mean, when we were in London with Dr. Chris Day, he's the National Health System whistleblower. He turned to one of their ministers and said, do you want one of your family members in our hospital, in our ICU, if those ventilators aren't clean? You want that ventilator on your mother? Are you willing to take that chance? And you can just hear the pin drop because Dr. Day was right. None of us want to drink dirty water. None of us want to see our family members in harm's way. None of us want a product that's going to blow up in our face because somebody was a bystander, somebody didn't speak out, somebody didn't do the right thing. So we need to bring a culture of right doing to this conversation, and we need to have better protections for the whistleblowers, but better accountability. And that's where I think if we have a framework that also involves this idea for redress for detriments, as they were calling it in the UK. In the US, we think about it as compensation for pain and suffering. That's the way we move forward, because if there's no accountability for the corruption, then corruption continues no matter how many lofty aspirational goals and policies you put on paper. So I'm here to say, let's work together, let's do a better job, and I'm looking forward to hearing what other people have to say today.
Thank you so much, Professor Garrick. I have numerous thoughts and questions to ask you and so forth, but we'll get to those. It's now my pleasure to ask Thandeka. Are you online? So Thandeka, is Thandeka online? Can she hear me? I can't see from here.
What's the last name?
Gqubule-Mbeki. Okay, she heads the work stream in the Anti-Corruption Council, but she lives in the Eastern Cape, so I don't know if she's had a problem, online problem. But you can live anywhere in the country and have an online problem nowadays. I understand that. Is Professor Fikeni on? Head of our Public Service Commission. Okay, we're obviously going to have more time. So let me just get my anti-corruption. There are. I'm gonna invite the respondents to comment, but from this a little bit the two presentations, and to some extent the exchange, there are three questions or areas that kind of leap out at me. The one is to think about retaliation. I think Professor Garrick is suggesting that we need to think about the ways in which people in positions of authority, whether in the public sector or the private sector, can retaliate against whistleblowers. It's not only by placing their physical lives in danger. So that's certainly a big challenge to my own thinking, to this point, understanding that whistleblowers face forms of retaliation, some of which may be very subtle. They are all abuses of power, and some of them may not be maybe beyond the reach of the law as the legal provisions of various kinds of law are currently framed. The second area concerns how we think about harm in the whistleblower context. If we think, it's certainly physical harm is the most clear and present danger, and I can tell you that I mean that's what's really generated the level of concern in the country, because we have corrupt criminals who are attacking whistleblowers physically.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes.
But what you're inviting us to think about is in much broader terms, psychosocial terms, about the way whistleblowers may be harmed, and that invites a broader response I think the Minister will probably agree that we start to think about whistleblower protection in policy terms and institutional terms. The UK appears to be considering setting up of a whistleblower agents protection agency, but the Minister will also know that the Zondo Commission, among its proposals, is to establish a whistleblower protection agency. And one of the things we are thinking about in the National Anti-Corruption Council, as we think about strengthening existing institutions and whether or not we need to introduce new institutions, is whether any institution, either an existing one, John, or any new one, should include whistleblower protection, deal with procurement fraud, because if you look at the Zondo Commission's proposals, they tend to have an agency for every particular problem. Maybe they didn't have the time to think through. We have to think in broader terms about what institutional arrangements we need to be thinking about. And certainly, I think that the question of institutional protection through an agency, an existing one or new one, to provide comprehensive support rather than just protection for whistleblowers is going to have to become part of the national debate. And the third area that I think becomes very clear from your presentation is that whistleblower protection and whistleblower support has to be a central pillar of our anti-corruption strategy. Mm-hmm. And again, yes, let me say also for our online audience, is that I think the South African public discourse, maybe because lawyers have been too prominent, is that they're emphasizing, as we should, accountability through better investigation and prosecution. But this conversation begins to broaden our vision about what needs to be done if we are going to succeed over the long term. And if we're going to succeed in the long term, then we have to ensure that decision makers, people who have authority, both in private companies and in government, have to take more and more responsibility for the way employees are treated in the work environment. And the Minister did talk to this question of people being abused in employment situations. So with that, I'm going to ask the our equally auspicious panel of respondents to enter the conversation. First, I'm going to ask Aslam Mayat, who is an attorney and also an executive member of the Active Citizens Movement, to make his observations. If there's anything you want to say, Aslam, about your biography that may be of interest to the participants, please feel free to do so.
Yeah, I think because of time limits.
Is Fikeni on?
Fikeni will join us in 15 minutes.
Oh, okay. Go ahead, Aslam.
Okay. The PDA and the LRA, am I coming? I'm getting an echo.
There is an echo, but we can hear you.
Okay. The PDA and LRA is clearly not working. Tinkering with it is not going to cut it. The fundamental problem is that reporting is often to the perpetrator, and the employee faces financially and emotionally draining endless litigation. The Active Citizens Movement, of which I'm a member, submitted to the Zondo Commission, and I'm glad that Professor Cachalia spoke about an independent body, because that's exactly the submission we made to Zondo, that an independent body be established to receive, process, prosecute, evidence brought by whistleblowers, which provides confidentiality and independence, and would also look at providing the support that's required, legal support, financial support, emotional support. But amending legislation without the proper enforcement is really a waste of time. The corporates and government are equally culpable. BLSA was quick off the mark to readmit Bain and Company, and Athol William lives in exile. Cynthia Stimple saved SAA 256 million, but lost her job. She was praised by Minister Godin, but neither the government nor private sector will employ her, despite all her qualifications, experience, and integrity. The government makes a lot of promises, but allows PRASA to hound Mata Ngoyi, despite her having won every endless case of litigation. The government must put a cap on frivolous litigation. Look at the response to Dr. Tim Meyer. It was absolutely disgusting. We need public-private partnership to set up a fund for whistleblowers, and we need an independent body to manage the process. I think that takes my 2 minutes, so I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
If I can just ask you to communicate with me, if you don't mind. Perhaps you can send through your suggestions about this new institution, and I would very much look forward to a conversation with you, given your experience and your references to various particular cases. Invite you to work with the council to share your insights and your thoughts. I'm now going to ask June Bellamy to add her thoughts. I met June maybe about a month ago. She came up to me. I was attending the annual anti-corruption conference convened by the Public Service Commission. And that's one of the areas we're going to be having to look at, John. So many of existing institutions have complementary mandates as we rethink the institutional architecture. So June approached to me and we had a little bit of a conversation about her experiences. And I felt, privileged to meet June for the first time. And we are meeting again. I think in the same trench to take this noble struggle forward. So June is going to share some reflections, which is informed by her personal experience. But my impression is, because she's also been working with Professor Garrick, that she's taking a broader policy-orientated interest in this important area. So, June, over to you.
Thank you very much. Lovely to be here, and hello to everybody online. Brief history of my background and why I've landed up here, because as you say, nobody wants to be a whistleblower when they're growing up. You don't even know what the word is. And the reason why, Jackie's here is because I had to reach out somewhere to somebody. There was no psychosocial support in South Africa at the time. So I'm 6 years into my journey now, coming up 1st of June. I am a Samsung whistleblower, a corporate whistleblower, so not state capture. There's crossovers and there are differences in these arenas. And while I've been in this space, early on, I reached out to other whistleblowers. I found some state capture whistleblowers, we set up our own little group, a little WhatsApp group, and that was our support system. But at the time, it was whistleblowers trying to help whistleblowers. We didn't know what was happening to us. I certainly didn't. I didn't have the languaging of what happened to me at the time or what was happening to me after the time. One of my saving graces is just before I whistleblew, I started studying at Stellenbosch University, and I now have my postgraduate certification in mindfulness-based interventions. So that was a very serendipitous journey because I'll give you a brief history. When I whistleblew, I went on a week's study leave, a week's leave, and I came back and I had a retaliation email directed at me coming from the HR department. In Samsung, you whistleblow to the internal auditors, and there is a confidential hotline. So you come back, you whistleblow because you're doing the right thing, and the retaliation started straight away. I was in that space for about a year, and in that time, when Jackie approached me to contribute to the book, she gave me the headings and she said, could you send me any scenarios of any of these? And I gave her scenarios on every single one of them. But then in that education, I could more see what was happening to me. Notably the gaslighting. And that is one of the key things that starts, in the retaliations. I'm not going to go down that road. But the point that I'm going to make now is this. All companies have company policies, and they are very nicely written, and they're there for staff to see. And if we look at all the companies that are, implicated with whistleblowers coming forward, nearly every single one of those companies have broken those policies. That is the fundamental problem there, because the policies mean nothing, because they will break the policies if it is profit over people. And that is one of their driving factors, is that if they have to cover up something and hide something, they will throw you under the bus as the whistleblower, because if you unknowingly bring it up to their attention, but they already know, they will start the retaliation. So they will breach all of these policies. I had to do an exercise with an attorney at one stage, and I counted about 130 times in the space of a year that I had raised the issues without having to say that I'm a whistleblower, because I thought only the auditors knew at the time. And when you approach them, the retaliation starts very quickly. The comment that I got is, you need to go get yourself an attorney. Now, companies also teach you about their whistleblowing policies, and they say that they will protect you, and they don't, because again, when it is profit over people, they will do whatever they take, or whatever it takes to protect their brand. Now, in the scenarios that I went through, I was fortunate enough to become very aware of what was happening to me. When I was being given one instruction, but then I was being blocked and hindered to execute that instruction. So that is where the psychosocial damage comes into play. But as I mentioned, you don't know what's going on with you. So it is only by my own resilience and my own strength that I got through that year. So now what are we looking at? I've cashed in my pension. I am unemployable because I'm a whistleblower, but more so with myself. And as I've come to know Jackie and I've learned my terminology, my symptoms, I have PTSD. So my PTSD unfolds in a workspace. So if I can't even think about applying for a job because I see a hierarchy structure, and I had total failures in the hierarchy structure. When I went to HR, I went back to the auditors, and I worked myself all the way up to the president eventually, where I had to say to him, listen, I'm a whistleblower. This is what's happening. Please, will you help me? In tears, I begged him repeatedly. But they will always put the brand over the whistleblower. So let me not digress too much. What happens through all of this situation, once you get out of it, because I was in there for a year. So for me, I was in a state of fight and appease. So your psychosocial effects, you can't live in that state because you are fighting to stay alive and stay aware and who's doing what to me, but you also have to appease your bosses and do your job. So you have this extreme push and pull. Years later now, I now have hypertension, which is heart attack level stuff. That's how my system became dysregulated. The sleep, I don't sleep without taking something for sleep. And there are a myriad of other things that it affects you. And as recently as September, and I say this.
If I can just put
sure,
a
yes,
spotlight on that.
Very much
so. When you talk about the assassinations, and there's no dismissing that, but this is also the slow killing of the whistleblower, is some of these psychosomatic symptoms, because they are so they are deadly. I mean, we've talked to whistleblowers and we've looked at research that stress is related to autoimmune diseases, cardiovascular diseases, and some cancers have been shown to be stress related. So I've had whistleblowers who have tried to get some research and studies done so that we can start making those correlations. So that's the slow death. That's the slow kill.
And the effects of this all of the accumulation, this is the institutional betrayal. From the very beginning, that's where it starts. The institution is supposed to protect you. So there is hope, though, Minister, because through all of this, the key, one of the key factors as well, in my scenario, so I'm single, I don't have a partner, I don't have children, so I had no community, no person to buffer off at all at any stage. I made a conscious decision to stop talking about it with my family members because I saw the damage it was doing to them. Now, the financial decimation is key. If you don't have finances to sustain yourself, then there's a myriad of breaches to the Constitution, my right to work, my right to dignity, the financial decimation, the mental degradation, and also the physical. And for myself, at this point, knock on wood, hasn't come into play. But through all of this, in reaching out, there has been a lot of information being shared. There are a lot of solutions. The problem that I'm starting to see now is that, but you've already given solutions to engage with your endeavors, is there are very simple, quick, easy fixes. And when I say a fix, it is effectively a block that the attorneys can't get through. And I'll give you an example. The first thing that they say to you in their defense, you are not a whistleblower. Now, in the documents that you sign or whenever you make your disclosure, there's nothing there that says you are a whistleblower. Because when I decided, I went online and I went, where's the whistleblower form? Where there must be a global generic whistleblower form. And of course, there's not. But in that form, it needs to say, this company so-and-so, we acknowledge the information, your whistleblower number is X, Y, and Z, and the word whistleblower is in there. Now, I had the foresight to whistleblow in different forms. So the document signed in the business doesn't have it. When I use the confidential hotline, I have the email there that says, dear whistleblower, we acknowledge your information and we start an investigation. Now, lawyers can't get around that though. But there's no legislation in the PDA that states, or there's no paperwork that says, when I sign the document, I want that word in there. And this is where I want to advise Mr. Moderator, he should have said, I'm now disclosing under as a whistleblower so that he can be afforded all of that. Because the next retaliation that comes is DAVO. They deny, they attack, and they reverse victim. If you're giving all the information and he's making all this disclosure, look at who's denying, look at who's attacking, and look at who's trying to reverse victim. So when I talk about hope, with much appreciation and find the right word here, timing. The Whistleblower House came to be last year. They've had their struggles. In the space of a year, they've managed to get some funding. And only as of 3 months ago, I have now got, as they call it, the essential funding for food, electricity, water, lights, petrol. But I have got 7 court cases against me. I represent myself in all of them because legal aid only takes 1. Legal aid, 5 years later, have done nothing. But I used that as a defense when SA Home Loans tried to take my home in the High Court. And Samsung has now wanted to enter into settlement agreements. So now sine die that those take place. So all of these things I've learned myself, which should not be the case. So there's a lot of effort being looked at further down the line. And of course, it's important to look at, you know, the witness protection programs and all of that. But in the beloved Archer's words, we need to go further upstream. So, as some have suggested, example Bain, we need to start looking at banning companies that don't adhere to their company policies. It sounds so simple, but that is a harsh reality. That's what they will feel. And the fining and all the rest of it needs to go into example the UK, the House of the House Office of the Whistleblower. In South Africa, we have a myriad of very good civil societies. If they don't want to do it, we had a very nice conversation with OUTA. I'm not saying they are there, but in my mind, I'm thinking, who is reputable? The Whistleblower House, ACM, OUTA. If we can release, and this is what I asked Judge Zondo, and I asked the day before at that event, we have, and I would like to find out under PIA, Promotion of Access to Information Act, how much money is sitting in the CARA funds, because that is where we can get the funds to support us. And in the support, it needs to be much broader looking at what we need. But we've been working on this, and I say there's so many whistleblowers that have come into the space, given their input and stepped up to try and move on with their lives. Some of us are going to be doing this for quite a while, and there are tangible solutions. And even when you talk about who is and isn't a whistleblower, there are plans that we have put in place, because that is one thing for us. You also don't want to sully the space with everybody crying, I'm a whistleblower. So it's things like the timeline. How quickly do you do it? Because you can't sit in it and be complicit for 20 years and then give evidence at the Zondo Commission and go, I'm a whistleblower. You are you were complicit and you are giving witness. You are a witness now. So there's a myriad of things that we've been working on, and the good thing in this week, while Jackie has been here, is that everybody is talking about collaboration, but also between the different parties, because we can't keep on, if we're looking at the same system, in my opinion, we can't just beef it up. There needs to be tangible changes that are actionable, and they need to be happening quickly. I had the sheriff of the court round to my house 3 weeks ago, so I don't know how much longer. I literally said, please hold back. I have a guest coming from the US. I need the fridge. So,
there's a reality to that.
Exactly. Things are moving slowly, but we are at a tipping point, and I am also a prisoner of hope, and there is much that can be done. And when we're collaborating together, it can be done. But we need to be looking at the right places. And I echo what Jackie said. And I mean, I found this out independently. Canada, from their own words, they are looking to us for input. So the doors are open, the conversation is open, and there's much to be done.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for those also moving sharing of your experience, June. I want to know if Professor Fikeni has joined us.
Yes, I have joined.
Very good evening to you, Prof.
Good evening.
I'm very pleased that you could join us. I was boasting with Professor Garrick beforehand that you will be joining us along with Deputy Minister Jeffery, and then when you didn't come on earlier, I thought, well, maybe I wasn't believed. But I did explain, you know, that you heading up our Public Service Commission, and that that's the very important institution in our constitutional makeup, and of course that you know, the whole area of corruption and public administration falls within your purview. So very welcome, and we're looking forward to your sharing your observations with us.
Thank you very much. And again, I'm glad to be part of the program.
Please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation, and I also would like to thank Cook and Pillay for facilitating my participation. It's quite insistent. We are driving from the Citizens Forum in deep rural areas, but I'm happy that I'm connected. Most important is that with the whistleblowers, we have realized after the State Zondo Commission and several other reports of corruption how important the role of whistleblowers is. And it is for that reason that we have also realized that these people, for being patriotic, sacrificing everything to save public resources, have been targeted to a point of becoming exiled in their own lands, harassed, and some of them having to leave the country. And we are now embarking on a process of coordinating the meeting of the Department of Justice and all other departments which are related, and the law enforcement agencies, wherein they will be able to come up with a framework. We do have a clear framework for witness protection program. We do have a framework for the protection of investigators. But it became very clear after these testimonies of people who were left destitute because of their whistleblowing that we do not have a clear framework for protection of whistleblowers, and more importantly, for them to be absorbed back into public service or into any company or organization they were working in. And it is for that reason that we have approached the Department of Justice and the minister, and we're raising the possibility of having short-term relief for those who are currently financially stranded, whilst we are developing well-coordinated policies. And for that reason, we welcome the launch of this book, because we will learn from all this well-researched, evidence-based material on what are the best practices and what are the actual experiences. So I do congratulate the author, and I do congratulate the organizers of this book launch, and we will be reaching out to make sure that when we have our whistleblower workshop with the stakeholders, they participate and become part of the journey of reforming our policies. Be playing a vital catalytic role in that sense. I thank you. If the network is not stable, it's because I am traveling from those villages. But I felt that it was very important that at least I do express our support for the program. Thank you.
We're going to call on Mr. Illich of Howard University. If you don't mind introducing yourself with a little bit more than the reference I have made to your university. If you could share some of your biographical information with us and then proceed with your observations, please.
Thank you for this opportunity. I'm a senior fellow at the Department of Sociology and Criminology at Howard University. I also work with Coogan at the World House Global Network as part of Stanford University. I also work with the Department of Psychiatry at Stanford University on neurodiversity and how to manage neurodiversity. We have an annual summit that I'm involved in planning and organizing. I would say I'm an unsung hero of the anti-apartheid movement. But I have some slides that I would like to share. If you just bear with us for a minute.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. This event, you see the slides?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So this event represents a great example of how we can build bridges across national, disciplinary, and institutional boundaries to address a critical crisis. In building this bridge, we take inspiration from a time when we were willing to put everything on the line to get Nelson Mandela and his comrades out of jail and end the oppressive system of apartheid. For us in the US and elsewhere, South Africa was a beacon of hope for transformation toward justice. Today, we need to discover how we can revisit the spirit of anti-apartheid movement to deal with the current crisis. The process will allow us to access the intellectual and financial resources necessary to deal with a number of persistent complex problems the existing institutions have been unable to address. Jackie's book provides an excellent point of departure for innovative thinking at the intersection of mental health and law. Yet, this area requires a lot more investment of resources. The following examples illustrate the close connection between law and mental health here in the United States. According to a report by U.S. Legal Services Corporation, low-income Americans don't get any or enough legal help for 92% of their substantial civil legal problems. Half of low-income Americans who personally experience the problem say these problems substantially impact their lives, with the consequences affecting their finances, mental health, physical health, and safety and relationships. On the other hand, three largest mental health institutions in the US are jails. LA County Jail is number 1, Cook County Jail in Chicago is number 2, and Riker Island Jail in New York is the number 3rd biggest mental health institution in the US. One point that I would like to make is the need to address the psychological barriers to speaking truth to power. When asked by a senator at the congressional confirmation hearing for Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas why she didn't come forward with her allegations earlier, Anita Hill simply said, "I don't know." We urgently need to address these psychological barriers through research, experimentation, and encouraging collaboration between lawyers and mental health professionals. Normalizing such collaboration may not be easy due to how these fields are siloed. Now, how do we encourage this collaboration? We need to collect and disseminate stories of individuals impacted by toxic workplace environment, retaliation, and gaslighting, as well as those who have mustered the courage to stand up to powerful forces. We need to design and develop structures for legal and mental health scholars and practitioners to work collaboratively with individuals and impacted communities. Beyond such collaboration, moving forward requires a network of creative collaborators from a wider range of fields to help create a transformative ecosystem. There are problems we call wicked problems that cannot be solved through normal approaches. Solving these problems requires a moonshot mindset. Look forward to working with you to develop a moonshot mindset.
Great. I have a colleague, Mr. Illich, in the law school, Professor Woolman, who has published a book last year called Wrecking Ball, in which he makes considerable use of this concept that you've made reference to of wicked problems, which and that will be of interest to you, John, as well. And I think in South Africa, you've put your finger on a broader set of issues. They concern climate change, for instance, but I think anti-corruption may be one of them. If we think about it as a wicked problem, the solutions require, as you say, creating a collaborative ecosystem. They require networked solutions, if you like. And we tend in this country, you made reference to our transition, which was a time of great optimism. We're in a much more pessimistic period. It's less easier for us to see transformative possibilities and to feel empowered to take such action. If we appreciate, as you're indicating, that we face these kinds of wicked problems, climate change is another, that requires a different kind of approach to collaboration, to leadership, to long-term thinking. It's empowering because we then realize that these problems may not be insurmountable, that we're going through perhaps a trough, that many countries across the world, US included, face, maybe the US especially, face these deep-seated, wicked problems that require new ways of collaborating, leading, envisaging, and so forth. And that is the way to see a way forward from, if you like, these dismal times. Thank you. I really enjoyed your presentation. If you can, Coogan maybe can send us the slides. I'm going to use that in my own classes, I think. I think the students in my class think I'm the wicked problem. Anyway, so Michael is next. Is Michael on?
Michael and But
Okay.
Parliament is also in Washington.
So who's
They are
next?
So they've got asked Nicola to step in.
Okay, Nicola.
So, just by way of brief introduction, I'm Nicola Sayed and I represent Primerio International. So as Kubi mentioned now, our directors, John Oxenham and Michael James Curry, who's scheduled to be on today's seminar as well, are currently traveling, unfortunately. So essentially, Primerio is a Pan-African law firm based in Johannesburg, and we practice in the fields of competition, antitrust, and anti-corruption. And as part of our advocacy initiatives, we often engage in crucial discussions such as today's seminar. So where we have the opportunity to collaborate, as you said, June, with organizations that are also in this space. So separately, I would also like to thank everyone in the audience and also in the virtual audience for attending today and for your time. In the midst of a massive grand scheme of corruption currently ongoing in South Africa, particularly in relation to a number of state-owned entities and major multinationals, the role played by whistleblowers has become clear. While the Judicial Commission of Inquiry had the potential for immense progress in this regard, we have seen many whistleblowers ostracized by the general public and the businesses that they have exposed. Whistleblowing is one of the most effective methods internationally for ensuring that public and private organizations are kept in check. And in this regard, it's a clear opportunity that exists to bolster our whistleblowing regime. Although enforcement in South Africa has historically been ineffective, bolstering the reward is increasingly important as enticement must be balanced with the threat of ultimate enforcement. A key feature of the 2021 OECD recommendations on combating bribery of foreign public officials in international business transactions is the protection of reporting persons. In this respect, the recommendations note the essential role that reporting persons can play as a source of detection of corrupt conduct in the form of bribery. In this regard, the recommendations urge OECD member states to enforce strong and effective legal and institutional frameworks that both protect and provide remedies against retaliatory action to whistleblowers working in the public or in the private sector. Inter alia, the recommendations also urge member states to raise awareness and provide training on the design and implementation of the legal and institutional frameworks to protect reporting persons. As whistleblowing is becoming an all the more prevalent mechanism to bring to light any wrongdoing in organizations, it's crucial for organizations to ensure that the risks associated with the potential consequences following whistleblowing are mitigated as far as possible. Individuals within an organization are well aware of the severe and dangerous consequences which are likely to be exposed to them when they are blowing the whistle. Employees rarely choose to blow the whistle to the broader public instead of using the internal mechanisms within a company to blow the whistle when the latter option is a viable option. I'll end with this. Public whistleblowing is almost always a matter of last resort and as a result of inadequate and ineffective internal whistleblowing mechanisms. Thus, from a business perspective, the need for good whistleblowing mechanism is clear. Further, from a business perspective, internal whistleblowing programs can assist in a number of ways, including by mitigating legal and financial risks for businesses, protecting stakeholders such as employees, customers, and shareholders, ensuring increased accountability within the organization, improving company culture, and enhancing an organization's competitive advantage by signaling to stakeholders that the organization operates with integrity and transparency. Thank you. I'll hand over to the rest of the panel.
Thank you, Nicole. Very brief, but very pointed. Thank you very much. Before I open to our online audience, I would like to ask the members of the audience, there are very few of you, to introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about yourself. I'm very appreciative that you're here. If you have any observations that you'd like to make, feel free to do so. And then we'll go on to the online audience. I noticed that Eleanor Sisulu has joined us there. I'm very pleased about that, Eleanor. Eleanor is very well known in our country. She wrote a wonderful book on her father-in-law, great South African leader, I think definitely one who lives very fondly in all our hearts. She's online. So I just thought, so she comes from an illustrious struggle family, and I thought I'd just introduce her. I'm very pleased that she's joined this conversation. Please go ahead, sir.
Do I need to come to the mic?
Yeah, that's fine. Please do that.
I can use this one. I don't mind. My name's John Clark. I'm a social worker, and I have just seen proof of the existence of God, because you're an answer to prayer, Jackie, and so are you, I have to say, June, because I've been working for the last 3 years in the whistleblower space as a social worker with 40 or so years of experience, working more as an activist. Found myself sucked into this rather vacant niche to provide psychosocial support to whistleblowers, and the story about it is in the daily last Mail and Guardian. I've got an article there which explains where I come from and what I do, so I'll just refer you to that. Not because I'm wanting to boast, it's just because I want it on record that South Africa, I don't think we appreciate just how critical the situation is. I loved what you said about the fact that whistleblowing should be the central pillar of any anti-corruption strategy. And in that thing, I quote Colette Ashton, I quote other people who have helped me understand what is happening in this country. And I guess the challenge is to Deputy Minister Jeffries, because after 2.5 years, after Mandy Wiener's book, after all that the Zondo Commission has done, why is the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development still simply saying, oh, we've got a meeting planned, oh, we're going to do this? If we were serious about corruption, we would have got to work even before the Zondo Commission had delivered its report. We would have got to grips with the fact that whistleblowers need to be protected and supported and incentivized, whatever it is, and leave aside all these kind of abstract debates about benefits and all the rest, and get on with the job. And I say this with a measure of frustration, because as a social worker, I have limited capacity. I have 30 clients who are whistleblowers, some of whom are people from within the Department of Justice, from within the National Prosecuting Authority, across all institutional frameworks. And what I am seeing from that underside is the fact that, and all I can say, I'm going to quote Olive Schreiner when she talked about Cecil John Rhodes, the worms of falsehood and corruption creeping. And I want to honor that, because she saw that Cecil John Rhodes and what was happening there was going down into trouble. Then there was an Anglo-Boer War which started. Olive Schreiner intuitively knew that. That's why I'm wanting to honor the Shriners for the fact. And I feel that we're at the same place now. And I just cannot understand why it's taking so long. And to put it really down to earth, this morning, I got a call from one of my clients saying, John, there's some people looking very suspicious in my area and telling me I've had to leave my house and go and stay somewhere else. At 11 o'clock last night, he said that. I was panicking. I thought, what can I do? Do I phone the police? Well, look what's happened to Patricia Mashale and other police officials. They're out the country for fear of their lives. What do I do? So I've put the word out, and that's why I say proof of the existence of God, and just went to my faith community and just asked them to pray. Fortunately, he's okay. Fortunately, he met now today, and I think he won't mind me telling you this because he's now gone public. Mzuma Katse was about to meet the National Commissioner of the National Lotteries Commission, the new appointed, where she's going to be talking with him, as she's spoken to others, of how they can ensure that justice is done to the whistleblowers that exposed the lottery corruption and the worms of falsehood and corruption that were creeping there. He has now written a piece which is in the Daily Dispatch this morning, in which he talks about the ethics of power and the power of ethics, and how those within power and I say to my clients, don't just speak truth to power, understand the truth about power. Power is inherently self-deceiving. And I want to say, Minister Jeffries, I believe that the Department of Constitutional Development, the government, the ANC that you belong to, are still in a state of self-deception and denial. They are not seeing the truth that's staring them in the face. And if they were to really listen to whistleblowers, they would.
Yeah, let's just remember that this is an academic forum. Ministers here, I'm appreciative that he's here to engage in a policy-orientated conversation, but I do understand your frustration, and it does speak to, I think, the depths of where we are in the country, and the deep feelings that this is invoking. You, sir, can you tell us who you are? Introduce yourself.
Good evening. My name is Moses Pito. I'm in charge of the
Sorry, we couldn't hear you. What's that? Sorry, we have someone speaking. Sorry, mute yourself, please.
You should have the mic. Where's the mic?
We just mute the person. I don't want.
Mute everybody on.
Okay.
Firoz, what happened to the mic because they can't hear him?
Thandeka, do we have a mic there? Thanks.
No, thank you. Now, I was saying my name is Moses Pito. I'm with the IC, responsible for citizen and democracy education. And also, I delve in other areas of thought leadership that I coordinate, and also undertake seminars on research for IC. Now, as it relates to the discussion here today, maybe at some point, as South Africans, we must accept that there is a threat that goes through us as a people, that the powerful people in this country are corrupt. And it becomes difficult for small people in this country to raise issues against powerful people in this country because they have all the powers. In fact, they are in a position where they can line up all the institutions that we are talking about here. That we need people. We need people that are going to assist us in putting systems in place, have policies that can protect whistleblowers. But if you have a situation where you could actually line up the Auditor General to be part of a corrupt scheme, you must accept as a country that you have challenges, because I have experiences of such, where you even go to the public protector, there's no help. So that's what the kind of challenges that South Africans have. At some point, we've got to accept that we are a corrupt nation. And once we start from there, maybe we can come up with solutions. This thing that we are, lying to ourselves that there are, powerful people that are honest in the country, we're just playing games. We're having that challenge. At some point, once we accept that, maybe we'll come up with solutions that can actually address all these problems that we have. Thank you.
Great point. Thank you. You, sir?
Yes. Thanks. Can I speak like that, or I need to speak with the mic? I don't like mics.
Yeah, the mic is there so that people who are online can hear you.
Enough. John, just to tell you, pray on answer my prayers. I want to read the small little mail that I sent to the Justice Department of South Africa. The Chief Justice, my name is Ilma Kramer. I'm unemployed. I'm actually medical disabled because of whistleblowing. Okay. For the last 22 years, I'm blowing the whistle for a company breaking the law. Legal stuff that's published in the government gazette, it's law. It is not corruption, it's life or death. We had it in Beirut, in the harbor. People knew. Nothing was done. 200 people are dead. Have a look at the video clips. To the Justice Department, the full letter is 14 pages. You can have it. Good morning, sir. Hope you are well and that this email finds you well. Please advise me who I should contact regarding the following matter in good faith. I hold the opinion that the legal system is not adequate to protect honest, law-abiding citizens of South Africa. Legal expenses are extremely expensive, and if I need to approach a USA legal company for assisting me to be helped and to protect my legal rights, then we have an enormous problem in South Africa. Legal aid has proven themselves to be totally ineffective. How do we expect SA citizens to abide by the law without any assistance? I'm asking for close to 2 years for an answer, and I'm being totally ignored and brushed off. I'm slowly beginning to understand the criminality problem in South Africa and have a few thoughts that I would like to share. I'm awaiting your reply. The reply, go and see legal aid. I applied for funds 2 years back, not even an answer. Not even a reply on follow-up mails. My legal cost, 1.2 million rand, out of my pocket, because I abided by the law of South Africa. Case number 338-2019 in Bloemfontein High Court. Have a look at the mess of the particular of claim, 65 pages. The first case in South Africa that is now filed in High Court, because I abided by the law when I worked. Now tell me quickly, put up your hands. Does it make sense? I don't see hands. I believe if I ask this on TV to South Africa, nobody except the crooked will put up their hands. Maybe they're not, I don't know. Maybe they will.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, I think that was the issue that was raised with those slides when we were talking about that there is no legal aid for, and he was talking about in America, where you would think there would be so much more availability of those kinds of things. But I think that as we think of that, as we look at legislation and what we could be doing here better, I know I saw some of the legal proposals to have like an advisory committee, and that's where I would say you need to go to a step further and really think about what they're doing in the UK to have an office of the whistleblower, because that means that you don't need an attorney. The office becomes the representative agent of the whistleblower, and the whistleblower goes away and the office takes the case and the office fights the case, so that it doesn't become up to the individual to then adjudicate the case. I mean, wouldn't you agree that we could take this out of these employment tribunals, then we take them back, we put them into the criminal courts, and then we're not trying to fight these things as employment, labor relations issues, but we're really getting back to the root of the problem.
I think the proposal for an broader support and an institution that has the responsibility as part of a wider anti-corruption agenda is very compelling. We will certainly look at the proposals before that's under consideration in the UK. I'm sure the minister's open to that suggestion. We are, I mean, as we think about these matters seriously, we're going to have to look at, you know, how we strengthen existing institutions, because we have a range of institutions, but some of them are captured. What new institutions we might need, and then take account of the country's overall socioeconomic position, and see, you know, what's the optimal institutional matrix for a country of the size, population and economy and so forth. We may not, the solutions that are on offer in countries that are richer may not all be feasible here, but we certainly have our our work cut out for us, and we are, I think we are looking at these questions seriously, and it's going to take time, because if you consider we will, there's no magic wand, there's no panacea, and I can honestly say, I think this is my considered view, that the country needs to have a long-term perspective. We need serious. We need to take the steps now, but if we're going to succeed over the long term, rebuild trust, rebuild institutions, deal with abuse of power across a range of institutions. The worst thing that we can do is look for politicians who will promise that they have a magic wand, that they can solve these problems overnight. We're at a point, I think, where these problems are deeply embedded, they're systemic, they cover a wide range of institutions. But, you know, South Africa has been through, like most countries, you go through cycles. There are moments of great achievement and moments of regression. And the question, we had a transition in this country away from an evil system. Nobody thought it was possible. Yeah, exactly. So and it's urgent now. And you, in fact, reminded me. So I would say this. At that time, it was the insurgent voice that started to prevail. I think if I think back to somebody like David Webster, he was a professor. You remember David?
He was one of my lecturers.
Right. Okay. So he was.
Speaking as an insurgent.
Yes, he was. So there's no disagreement here. I'm just saying to you that. But I mean, that moment was seized by great leaders, by a population that was aware, and we achieved something that was considered impossible at the time. And I think perhaps we're in another moment in which we have to tackle honestly, frontally, the problems we face, but with a degree of optimism. I think that this country has the resilience, the fortitude, the resources to deal with this this period of darkness.
Professor, I see you also have questions coming in from in the chat.
Okay, let's go ahead.
I see there are people who have been posting in the chat. Does somebody want to like raise a hand and ask a question?
Eleanor had a question as well.
Sorry, who is it? Eleanor. Okay. Eleanor, can you raise your hand? And go ahead with your question.
Actually, I didn't have a question. I had a comment, rather.
Please go ahead, Eleanor.
Okay. Yeah, my comment was that we really need a strengthening of civil society as a whole. We need all the fight against corruption. I liked Professor Illich's presentation, saying you need a whole ecosystem. And to strengthen the ecosystem, we need strong people in all the organizations, the legal support, legal aid organizations, any corruption watch, all these organizations. And I wondered why it is that, okay, I understand why corporates and why governments don't want civil whistleblowers, but for our organizations in the social justice sector, those would be the ideal people. And unfortunately, most of our organizations are struggling with funding and can't afford to employ people. I think it would really be great if there was some funding available to place whistleblowers within our organizations in various capacities. because they are the kind of people we need. And on the issue of a whistleblower, I think the Public Protector's Office, if it was working properly, would be the best place for a whistleblowers project. Unfortunately, it isn't, but I think we have to really find out how to upscale protection of whistleblowers and the support for psychosocial support. But I think the employment thing is really important. Also, we need a regional and international approach.
Thank you, Eleanor. Let's take one or two other questions or comments, and then I'm going to ask the panelists also to respond. Please introduce yourself. Sorry, we can't hear you.
Why don't you type your question in the chat and we'll read it?
Can you read from here?
I can read from
you.
behind me.
Sorry, please go ahead with your question. Introduce yourself and put your question.
I think his problem is the mic is not working, so that's why Jackie's asked him to type it.
Do you want to type your question?
I think it's just personal. Yeah,
okay, is that it?
Scroll up a little bit. So this is an allegation and action. The university is vigorously resisting, even though the timeline of events shows that Wits. Oh my.
I don't think that was him.
Marcus. So rights groups and lobbies housed in our institutions correctly honor their mandates to advocate for better protections for persons whose rights are violated, for whistleblowers. But what is the attitude of such rights organizations to whistleblowers who emerge from the ranks in institutions themselves? Well, I mean, I think that's where, when you look at universities and we look at college campuses and whistleblower laws and policies, very often they have their own policies that I think are sort of the gateway to what we see in the business world. So I think we were talking earlier about how every institution of higher learning should have classes on ethics and should have classes on whistleblower rights and protections, because it becomes part of so many other professions that I think that we could make a difference by starting before people even enter the workforce, by shaping the idea of how you learn to, I call it, how do you learn to be a giraffe? I've got my little, see, we use the giraffe as our mascot for Whistleblowers of America. I know that probably resonates with those of you here in Africa, but whistleblowers stand tall and stick their necks out. So I always say that ethics is really all about being a giraffe. And we could do that in educational spectrums with things that are age appropriate across multiple sectors.
Thank you. Any other giraffes out there? Are there some questions online? Comments? I'm going to ask Jeffrey and then Professor to make some closing remarks.
Yeah, I mean, maybe to the professor, I wasn't saying that whistleblowers are out to make money by blowing the whistle. I was raising the evidentiary problem in court, in our courts, of being negative about people who possibly are gaining, and negative in terms of how that affects
the probity of their evidence.
The probity of their evidence, yes. So just to clarify that point. Otherwise, look, I think it is a big problem, but I think it's a very complex problem. People end up in disputes with other people, particularly their employers. They think they're right. And they may or may not be right. But they can't accept if they're not right sometimes that they are not right, and they want to keep going. And we've got issues of vexatious litigants and things like that. So you also have that category of person who may claim to be a whistleblower when they're actually not, but it's something just to hold on to. So I don't think there's any magic switch. I was quite actually interested, Professor, that the figures that you gave, I mean, I don't know what the success rate for our Protected Disclosures Act is, but I think you gave 10% of the cases in the US, which was quite horrifying. So it is a greater global problem. Yes, in South Africa, well, in South Africa, we've got a specific problem with physical harm on whistleblowers. So my own view would be that's where we need to, whilst the issues of emotional harm and other forms of harm are important, the first thing is to stop people being killed, particularly whistleblowers being killed. So I think that's an important element, but I look forward to sort of further engagement. This is not, unfortunately, the gentleman has left. This is not my prime focus area, but I came in terms of showing, because I think it is an important issue, and showing, you know, seeing what could be done to yeah, I see there's a question, Mr. Konko. I had answered that, I thought, in the beginning. The issue is well, the issue is witness protection. The Witness Protection Act doesn't protect, it only protects witnesses, not just witnesses in a criminal matter, but witnesses more broadly. So if you're not going to be a witness, currently that act would not apply to you. The problem with witness protection is that it's relocation, which is not suitable for many people, probably most people. Okay, he says it wasn't answered. So I thought I had. So there's a review of both pieces of legislation, but I think the issue that Professor Cachalia raised is that there's no magic switch, there's no quick fix. It's something that other countries seem to be grappling with. It's something that we're grappling with, which is made even more urgent and complicated by the corruption that is taking place. I mean, the one thing I was quite interested in was I think your point of the and it was who was it, somebody online about people in the private sector who are whistleblowers not being able to get employment. So if we as a society valued whistleblowers, then there should be a number of people lining up to say, look, you're an honest person, can I give you a job? But that doesn't seem to be the case. It was your example, and I think the person working for SAA, or had been working for SAA. But yeah, so I think it's an issue that we need a lot more ongoing. I mean, we have the structures such as the Corruption Council. I'm disappointed in what you've said about Canada. I didn't select Canada. That was, I think, Canada offered. But I would be keen for further engagement with both of you.
But can I ask you? Yeah. I mean, we don't have too much time left, but I'm really tempted to engage with you a little bit, because it's not every day that we have this opportunity. So I understand where the Department of Justice might be coming from, where you as a minister, and I agree with you that our immediate challenge is to deal with physical harm. But if we look at the way the problem of corruption grew and became endemic in departments, and apparently, if we're taking the examples that we've been confronted with today, and as you know, maybe it's not received enough attention in private sector, then taking a broader view from a policy point of view, seems to make sense. There may be a lot of people, for instance, who are not, who don't report corruption because they feel that they'd rather not undertake a journey which carries these risks.
Right.
So if you want to deal with corruption, or you've got to start changing the culture and environment in organizations. If you have a culture of routine rule breaking in corporations, apart from that question of prevention, there is the I mean, I don't know if we are aware as much as perhaps we should be of the range of harms that whistleblowers are experiencing. So you know, I mean, you've compared the harm to war veterans. Now, if that is the case, John, then it might be that other departments need to think in their policy frameworks about interventions. And there may, in a country like this, be fairly limited. The resources will be constrained. But don't you think perhaps there is a compelling case being made here for a broader, multidisciplinary perspective to be adopted towards whistleblowing, and that would lead to different conclusions about not only about legislation but institutional transformation. Maybe we need a separate agency, or we need a department to have a directorate or something which looks at what appears to be something that's having consequences and impacts that we perhaps hasn't been part of the national conversation to the extent that it needs to be. And that's why you're having...
Yeah. No, I agree. Sorry, Professor Garrick, but just to respond before you come in, yes, I agree. I think that, I think the issue of physical harm and death is the more urgent problem, the more urgent immediate problem. But there's longer term issues. The sense I got from the discussions that we had beforehand, or you were having with Professor Garrick, was that her book was quite eye-opening in terms of the other forms, and I also found that interesting. I haven't read the book, so I do think into June, yes, I'm sort of not surprised about the personal cost, but one often doesn't think about it or what can be done to prevent it. So I do think there is a broader approach that needs to be followed from government, a broader issue of just physical protection and legal advice. But the
and relocating people and stuff. That's like at the end of the process.
Indeed.
You know, that's in the most.
So I am in support of that, and that's where I think we need further engagement.
So when I first started running the Defense Suicide Prevention Office, which was for all the military in the U.S., I had a chaplain tell me this story. It was almost a warning, and he said, "You're trying to prevent people from dying." So it's like watching a man drowning in the river. You're tempted to jump in and save him, and you may do that, and you'll save him. But then there's another, and another, and another. And you're going to jump in, and then eventually you're going to teach other people to jump in, and everybody's going to keep jumping in to try to save the drowning man. But what nobody is doing is going upstream to see that the bridge is broken, and that's why they're falling in. So we need to get upstream with our thinking and our solutions. So that's what I loved what you said. So when we're setting up this defense suicide prevention program, it had to be a policy office, as well as a program office, an evaluation office, and a research office. And it took us looking across these multiple sectors to think about how we pulled everything together to prevent suicide. So if you're trying to prevent murder, yes, you absolutely need to save that one person, but you also need to get upstream and think about how you're preventing the causes of murder and suicide. Because by the way, because I'm a suicidologist, suicide is a #1 leading cause of death in this country. And when we look at the number of working-aged adults who die by suicide, you'll see there are correlations to these hostile work environments, unemployment, and very much the disenfranchised, vulnerable populations that are not working, that are not part of the socioeconomic structure or have been divested from it, and they're falling off that socioeconomic ladder. And you need a program that oversees all of that.
So I'm going to bring this to a close. I think Kululeko Konko has also made the observation in the chat, echoing your points, Professor, that what we need is a multidisciplinary approach. And I really think that's the sort of key question that emerges out of this. And if I might say so, I think it's been great to have the Minister present, because respectfully, I can say I think that he's going to take this conversation forward in the policy circles that where it has an impact.
We may have to buy him a glass of wine.
Yeah, well,
and I also loved what Eleanor said earlier. I really wanted to pick up on that, because she said that we needed regional and international approaches. I mean, that's why I'm here. I know there are other Americans online. The Brits are maybe online as well. We've been sharing, and you've got whistleblowers that are in exile. So bring them home. Make it safe to bring them home. So you've got them in the UK, you've got them in Greece. I talked to them, bring them home.
On that note, I want to thank you very much, very sincerely. I think your work's really going to have an impact. I definitely am going to take these ideas forward to our council. Thank you very much, Minister, for, sorry, I forgot about Coogan. Yes. Coogan. Can I go ahead and just
go ahead, and I'll just take 2 minutes to wrap up.
I really appreciate you being here. I think it's testament to your public concern. I really appreciate you being here, and you're used to being in contested environments.
Oh, yes, so that's
fine. That's par for the course. But it might be reflective of the moment we're in. I think Thank you very much, both of you, for our panelists as well as respondents. All of you were great. Thank you very much to those of you in the audience and those of you from the law firm. Kugan, over to you.
Lovely.
For pulling this all together.
Thanks a lot. I think Prof. Firoz has done the vote of thanks. What's waiting outside is some refreshments and drinks for those who are inside, and those who are online can have a drink wherever you are. At least you don't have to drive. But I think what's important for me is you've heard, as much as we've had a few, and then online, the urgent concerns of whistleblowers. And I think from our perspective, what I'd like to put forward is just a couple points on short, medium, and long term. Deputy Minister Jeffery spoke about immediate concerns of life and livelihood, and I think there's a medium to long-term issues. So I think what's important is also, we mustn't forget, this is Human Rights Month, and I don't want to not mention it. And also, John mentioned Olive Schreiner, but I think we in the room that's named after the big man, we can't not acknowledge him. So I think we have to acknowledge where it all started from. And that's Mandela's 1994 constitutional promise of freedom, equality, and dignity. And that's your basic human rights in the Constitution. So I just want to speak briefly, and I want to go to the next steps, what we could try and do on in terms of taking some of these discussions forward. So essentially the present context, and then the key highlights from some of the individuals, and some closing remarks. So the background is, this started in 1994 with Mandela's promise of freedom, equality, dignity. The constitutional ideals, though, were interrupted with the state capture and grand corruption project. That led to Ramaphosa making the statement that corruption and state capture is the single biggest threat to our democracy. More recently, Chief Justice spoke about the massive deficit in integrity, accountability, and governance. And both Ramaphosa and Justice Zondo spoke about whistleblowers and commended them as true patriots, champions, and defenders of our human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. So presently, what is happening in the country? We have a multiplicity of crises. We are still the most unequal society in the world, despite 1994. We are a state under siege. We've got the army patrolling ESCOM, the army patrolling employees. We've got And we're seeing it in the increasing number of civil society protests that led former President Gqubule-Mbeki last year to talk about an Arab Spring in the waiting. So some remarks based on the inputs that we've received. You might remember that Ramaphosa spoke about the shame, embarrassment, and betrayal of our society. Zondo's recommendations about, amongst others, about whistleblower protection. And he also spoke about citizens being critical for an inclusive democracy. We've seen various, the vicious cycle of corruption and state capture with our huge development challenges, the ESCOM issues, and whistleblowers have been pivotal in exposing the malfeasance associated with state capture. And we've seen the escalating threat of assassinations to whistleblowers, leading Justice Kriegler last week to comment on a fast degenerating state into a mafia state. So the next steps, Professor Firoz, as I see it, is I think what's very urgent is the implementation of the Zondo report, timeframes, processes, including specific whistleblower protection and support. I think also what you said is important about the societal approach as per the NACAC and NACS, the strategic multi-stakeholder collaboration partnerships to address the reclaiming of captured institutions that have failed under government. And we need to look at multi-stakeholder partnerships, government, business, civil society, the Public Service Commission, you read Professor Fikeni, the UNDP, amongst others. And such programs should include the building of state capability through rebuilding institutions, professionalizing and capacitating the public service, and inculcating a values-based and ethical leadership approach, as it is in our founding constitution, so that we have good governance and we have the dignity of the people in terms of the rights. I think what's also important is to use Jackie's comparative analysis and lessons from the USA, the UK, and the EU to also engage with Deputy Minister Jeffery, following Minister Lamola's commitment at last week's conference on the constitutional promise of human rights and dignity. And I think, as you mentioned, Fazan made some interesting comments from Washington on the Stanford approach, and I think we need to look at that. That sums it up, but just some quick slides that tells the picture. This is Obama basically commending whistleblowers, and I think it talks to what you said anyway, Prof. Firoz, about the principles of Barth Appella. It's not just about whistleblowers, it's about citizens. They were not born whistleblowers. They were just doing what's right, as the gentleman said, in terms of the Constitution, and then they were victimized and experienced that. Again, the Zondo report, I think it's urgent to implement it. We've seen what happened to the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, 20 years, and we're looking at implementation now. I don't think the country can afford a failure in not implementing the Zondo Commission. And I think as we in the room of Mandela, I think he's done his bit, and as you mentioned, we can change the world if we do it together. If not, this is what's waiting for us. The poor will be looking at crumbs, and there'll only be a few that will be eating. And I think I want to wrap up with Mahatma Gandhi's comment on the world is big enough to satisfy everyone's needs, but will always be small for everyone's greed. And as he said, the future depends on what we do in the present. So I hear what Prof. Firoz is saying. It's going to take time, and Deputy Minister, but we also hear some of the concerns from the whistleblowers. And I think these things should run in parallel. And we have best practice approaches. Minister Lamola spoke about Deputy Minister Jeffery. Things have happened in the US and the UK and other areas. How do we pull them all together and support our government in making sure that the citizens enjoy and that the whistleblowers do not get prejudiced? With that, I think I'm over, and I think the wine is calling us next door.
Thank you, Kugan, for pulling all of this together. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Once again, thank you for coming.